There's a question that's been eating at me for a long time, and I'm going to ask it straight. When do you stop looking? Not for your keys. Not for your phone. I mean really looking. For a person. For someone you love so completely that the absence of them feels like a wound that doesn't scar over, just stays open, just keeps weeping, day after day, year after year, until you've almost convinced yourself that the pain is normal now, that this is just what life feels like, that the hollow ache behind your sternum is simply what it is to be you, in this version of the world where they are gone. When do you stop? I'll tell you when. You stop when the search teams go home. You stop when the posters on the telephone poles fade so completely that the ink runs pale and the paper goes brittle and the staples rust out, and one morning you drive past and they're not there anymore and you don't even notice right away. You stop when the volunteers who showed up that first desperate weekend stop answering your calls. Not because they're bad people. They're not. They just have children of their own, and jobs, and seasons that keep turning whether they want them to or not. And then one day you're sitting at a folding table in the basement of a church hall, drinking bad coffee out of a styrofoam cup, and a well-meaning woman from the County Victim Services office puts her hand on top of yours and says, in a voice that is genuinely kind even though it's been worn smooth by repetition, "We have not given up hope." And she means it. But you both know what she is also saying. What she is saying is, the file is still open, but we have run out of places to look, and what we are really doing now is hoping for a miracle. And miracles, in this business, do not come often. That's when you stop. This is a story about what happens after that point. After the looking stops. After 4 years of silence so complete and so heavy that it has settled into the bones of an entire community like a cold that never quite goes away. This is a story about what happens in the space between giving up hope and receiving a miracle, and more specifically, about the shape that miracle took. Because it did not take the shape anyone expected. It did not come from a tip line. It did not come from a database match or a surveillance camera or any of the tools the modern world has built for exactly this purpose. It did not come from a detective who woke up at 3 in the morning and finally saw the pattern. It did not come from another person at all. It came from a horse. I know how that sounds. But stay with me, because this is not a cute story about an animal doing something charming. This is something different. This is the kind of story that takes you apart and puts you back together slightly differently, and the piece that gets moved is your understanding of what loyalty actually means. Not loyalty the concept. Loyalty is a thing that exists in the world, that has weight and duration, that can survive 4 years of silence in a dollar auction in a cold desert wind and the patient grinding passage of time, and that can recognize, across a distance of smell and memory and something else we don't have a word for, the one person in the world it belongs to. Malheur County, Oregon. Say it out loud. Malheur. It comes from the French trappers who came through this country and found it beautiful and brutal in equal measure and named things honestly. Malheur means misfortune, bad luck, ill hour. They were not being dramatic. They were being precise. This is a county of 2 million acres and fewer people than some apartment buildings. The sagebrush goes on so long in every direction that after a while your eyes start to skip over it the way they skip over a word you've read too many times. The juniper trees grow gnarled and slow, 100 years to reach the height of a man, their roots going deep and desperate into volcanic rock. The canyons that cut through the basalt are old and quiet, and they hold their darkness close, even in afternoon light. Even in summer. The shadows down there have a quality you can feel on your skin, a coldness that has nothing to do with temperature, exactly. It is not a place that invites strangers. It is a place that takes things in and keeps them. The town of Arock sits in the middle of all this. Unincorporated. Population somewhere between 24 and 80, depending on who's counting. 1 gas station. One church with 3 denominations sharing a building because none of them has enough members to fill it alone. The Antelope outnumber the people 4-1, and the Antelope do not attend county meetings. This is the place where Sarah Jones, 12 years old, and Maya Smart, 11, got on their bikes on a Tuesday afternoon in June 4 years ago, and rode down a county road into the desert light, and disappeared. Just disappeared. No accident. No evidence of a crash. No abandoned bikes in a ditch. No sign of a struggle. No witness. 2 girls on bikes became, over the course of one dusty afternoon, a mystery. Then a tragedy. Then one of those permanent wounds that a small community carries without ever quite knowing what to do with. The search was as thorough as you can be in 2 million acres with a county sheriff's department of 6. Volunteers came by the hundreds, from Burns and Ontario and even from Boise across the state line. They walked grids. They checked the canyon systems. They called names until their voices gave out. Dogs were brought in. The FBI sent 2 agents. They came to the same conclusion as everyone else: nothing here. No trail. No thread to pull. The yellow ribbons tied to fence posts that first summer faded through autumn and winter, and by the following spring they were the color of old bone, rattling in the wind, more monument than symbol. 4 years. That's a long time to carry a stone in your shoe. That's a long time for a wound to stay open. Cliff Burrows was 62 years old, and he was not a complicated man. He would have said so himself, without embarrassment or pride, just stated it the way you'd state a fact about the land. 2 inches of rain last year. West fence needs new posts. Not a complicated man. He had lived in Malheur County his entire life, which meant he understood the land the way only someone born into a place can, not as scenery, but as the medium through which you move, the texture of ordinary days. He could read the sky well enough to know when the snow would come. His wife had died 15 years ago. Cancer, fast and relentless. His children lived in Portland and Boise and Sacramento, in places that had traffic and grocery stores, places that made a kind of sense Cliff had never quite translated into his own life. He lived with the land and the cattle and the silence, and he had made his peace with it. He had bought Bolt at an auction in Burns 2 years back. He found him in the back of a pen, standing very still while the other horses moved and jostled and announced themselves. This one was just standing there with his head at a medium height and his eyes open and quiet, watching. Watching the way an old man watches, with patience that has stopped needing to announce itself. He paid $75. Nobody else bid. The horse was underweight. His coat was dull. His ribs showed through in a way that made Cliff's jaw tighten. But the bone was good, and the eye was good, which matters more. This horse, as I told you that something difficult had happened and the horse had not been broken by it. Had absorbed it and continued, and was now simply waiting for things to improve. Which they did. Cliff brought him home, fed him properly, gave him real work, and over the following months the horse filled out and the coat came back, and the 2 of them arrived at the quiet, functional understanding that is the best thing 2 honest creatures can build together. He named him Bolt. Not because the horse was fast or electric. He named him Bolt because the horse was, if anything, a bolt in the architectural sense, the thing that holds other things together. Solid. Unremarkable. Fundamental. The day it happened was a Tuesday in October. The high desert in October has a specific quality of light and air that Cliff had never managed to describe to anyone's satisfaction, but that he recognized in the body, not the mind. The light goes thin and lateral. The air sharpens, picking up the mineral tang of the coming cold, and underneath that the dry sweetness of sage. He was checking fences on the east pasture, the kind of work that occupies the hands and leaves the mind in that useful wide-angle state, paying attention to everything without focusing on anything. The east pasture rolls up toward a formation of basalt locals call the Shepherd's Fissure. A box canyon, basically. Goes in 100 yards in dead ends, too narrow for cattle, too treacherous in wet weather. Cliff had ridden past it hundreds of times. Never gone in. Bolt stopped. Not a gradual slowing. A full 4-footed planted stop, sudden and complete, as if the ground in front of him had ceased to be navigable. His head came up fast, ears pinned forward with such force they nearly touched at the tips, nostrils opening wide, cycling through the cold air in rapid urgent pulls. Cliff nudged him. Bolt didn't move. He nudged harder. Bolt sidestepped, not away from the canyon but perpendicular to it, his eyes showing white at the edges. A tremor ran through the large muscles of his shoulder and haunches that Cliff could feel through his knees. Not the tight electric tremor of a spook, of a horse that smelled a predator. Something different. Longer. More sustained. The kind of shaking you see in a person who is holding themselves very carefully together while something enormous moves through them. Then Bolt made a sound. Low, resonant, rising from deep in the chest, not quite a whinny and not quite a moan. Something in between, something that had in it a quality of anguish and urgency and recognition that made the hair on the back of Cliff's neck stand up in a way it hadn't since he was a young man who had come across a mountain lion crouched not 20 feet away. He swung down from the saddle. He stood with his hand on Bolt's neck, feeling the pulse hammering there, rapid and hard, a trapped bird pulse. The horse turned and pushed his muzzle into Cliff's chest, an insistent pressing gesture, then pulled back and turned toward the cliff face beside the canyon mouth. Not into the canyon, but beside it, toward a stand of juniper pressed against the basalt in a dense, bristling curtain of needles and twisted wood. He followed. Because when you have spent 62 years in honest relationship with animals, you know the difference between a horse acting up and a horse trying to tell you something. It is not a subtle difference, once you felt it. And this was signal. Everything about this horse, in this moment, was signal. Bolt pushed his hand into the juniper branches and pulled. Cliff shoved him beside him, needles sharp against his face, the smell of crushed juniper dense and medicinal. And he saw it. Not a wall. A gap. A crack in the basalt that the angle of the rock and 30 years of juniper growth had concealed so completely that you'd have to be standing exactly here, at exactly this angle, to see it at all. No wider than a man's shoulders. Going back into the dark, turning slightly. The cold came out of it in a slow, steady exhale. And there was something else in that exhale, something that wasn't just cold rock and dust. Something alive. Cliff stood there for a long moment. He was 62. He had a fence tool on his belt. He did not know what was in that crack. He knew enough about the high desert, about the kind of people who came to it to disappear, to have a short and sobering list of possibilities. He went in anyway. Not because he had weighed the options, but because the horse had planted his feet and shaken and made that sound and pushed into the spot, and Cliff had been in honest relationship with animals long enough to know this was not nothing. The passage was dark and immediately claustrophobic. The wind died the moment he turned the first corner. The silence that replaced it was of a different quality than the silence outside. Not the open, ringing silence of the desert, but a shut mineral silence. The silence of a place that has been keeping its own company for a very long time. The walls were close enough that his jacket whispered against both sides at once. The basalt was damp, the stone weeping some faint subsurface moisture, and there was a smell, musty, organic, the smell of a place where living things have been for a long time. He stepped out into the basin. The world stopped making sense. It was not large. An acre, maybe an acre and a half, completely enclosed by sheer basalt walls that rose 60, 80 feet on every side. Walls that would be invisible from any altitude, hidden by the surrounding terrain, the basin sitting in the landscape like a secret kept in a closed fist. In 30 years of riding this land, Cliff had never known it existed. Against the far wall, built directly under a deep overhang, camouflaged with native grasses pressed flat against the structure, there was a building. Not a tent. Not a lean-to. A building. Reinforced walls. A heavy door set flush with the rock face. A small solar panel angled on the roof with the careful precision of someone who had thought hard about sun angles. Beside it, a neat enclosure of juniper posts and wire holding two goats standing close together with the compressed posture of animals that are frequently afraid. Cliff crouched behind a boulder. The rational part of his mind was building a list. The legal compound, isolated, well hidden, someone has lived here a long time. The older part of him, the part that was not rational but that was sometimes more accurate, was sending a simpler message: get out, get out, get out now. The door opened. A girl came out carrying a metal bucket. She was thin in the way people get thin when thinness is not a choice. Thin in the specific way of someone kept not quite starved but never quite enough, always at the edge of something. She was dressed in a garment made from several pieces of heavy fabric stitched together by someone with practical skill but no interest in aesthetics. Her hair was long and matted. She moved with her head down, shuffling slightly, the gait of someone who has learned that quiet, downward, unremarkable movement is the safest kind. She looked up. She saw him. Her face crumpled and went rigid in the same instant, as if two strong impulses were colliding. Beneath both of them, beneath the terror in the shock and the frozen animal stillness, there was something else. Something small and banked and hot, like a coal buried so deep under ash he'd almost stopped believing there was any fire left. He was still trying to understand what he was seeing when the door opened again. The man who filled the doorway was someone Cliff Burrows knew. Knew well. Recognized in the specific, unambiguous way you recognize someone who has been a presence in a community for years, who has attended the same meetings and eaten at the same tables, and whose face you have seen in the local paper alongside words like heroism and dedication and tireless. Mark Rogan, former chief of the County Volunteer Search and Rescue. The man who had organized the search, who had led the teams, who had wept at the press conferences with the controlled grief of someone trying to hold himself together for other people's sake, who had accepted the bronze plaque for extraordinary service and unwavering dedication, with a quiet humility that had moved people, that people still talked about, who had sat across a folding table from the girl's parents, multiple times over 4 years, and looked them in the eyes, who was standing now in the doorway of a hidden bunker in a box canyon no map had ever recorded, his hand resting on a holstered sidearm, and a smile on his face that Cliff Burrows would see in his sleep for a long time afterward. Not a surprised smile. Not the smile of someone caught. A patient smile. The smile of someone who has been managing a situation for a long time and regards this as simply the next thing to manage. "You're trespassing, Cliff," Mark Rogan said. Pleasantly. As if this were a conversation between neighbors about a fence line. "This is private land. I want to pause here, because this is the moment the story turns on. There is a particular kind of betrayal that is worse than ordinary betrayal. Ordinary betrayal is bad enough. But there is a category that goes deeper, the betrayal that uses something sacred as its vehicle. That hides itself inside a public act of goodness, wraps itself in grief and service and community, and uses those things as a coat, as camouflage, the way a canyon uses shadow and angle and the patience of decades to hide what it contains." Mark Rogan had not just taken 2 children. He had taken them and then stood among the people who loved them and performed their grief. He had looked their parents in the eyes. He had accepted awards. And while he did all of this, he had been going home, at the end of those days, to the hidden canyon, to the solar panel, to the goats in their neat juniper pen, to the girls he had decided, in the terrible logic of a closed mind that has mistaken its own certainty for righteousness, he had saved. This is the shape some evil takes. Not darkness. Not the absence of warmth. A conviction so complete and so wrong that from the inside it looks exactly like love. Cliff Burrows understood all of this in the time it took for a man's smile to settle into his face. He also understood that he had to get out. Not because he was a coward. He was not a coward. But he was 62 with a fence tool, and Mark Rogan had a pistol and had spent 4 years building a fortress he'd designed himself. There was one way in and one way out, and one of them was armed. He was going to have to be very calm. And very stupid. Stupid in the specific, useful way of a man who has seen nothing remarkable, who is simply a confused old rancher whose horse wandered too close to a rock formation. He was going to have to perform that stupidity convincingly enough that a man who had stayed ahead of an entire county's investigative effort for 4 years would let him walk out. He did it. He did it because 62 years in the company of animals had taught him one thing above everything else: how to stay calm when calm is the only tool you have. He backed out. He did not turn his back. He raised his hands, palms out. He made himself talk and made himself sound almost normal, which was the hardest thing he had ever done. When the anger meant Rogan could no longer see his face, he turned and ran. He came out of the rock into the wind, and the wind hit him like a thing with weight. He slashed the tide rein with his knife, launched himself into the saddle, and rode hard and fast up the ridge toward Idaho, 50 miles away, where sometimes a cell signal found you if you stood in exactly the right place. 1 bar. He dialed. The wind stole syllables. He said the words into the phone, words that were real, that he had seen with his own eyes, that would sound to the person on the other end like the words of a man who had lost his grip on the ordinary world. He said them anyway. The cavalry came the way it always does to remote high desert, loud, dusty, and slightly confused by the geography. Sheriff's vehicles on gravel produce a sound that carries for miles. The state police helicopter produced a sound that carried for further. Cliff stood by Bolt and told the story 3 times, and each time he watched the face of the person listening go through the same sequence: skepticism, recalibration, the specific gray horror of someone who has just understood something that cannot be ununderstood. Sheriff Brody scrubbed a hand across his jaw. "He built a fortress right under our noses," Brody said, very quietly, "and then came and stood next to us while we looked for them." I shook his hand. Cliff. I drank coffee with him. There was nothing useful to say to that. So Cliff didn't say anything. He just stood there with his horse, who was still agitated, still pacing in small circles, still whinnying that low, urgent call toward the crack in the cliff face. Over and over. With the stubborn insistence of something that has not yet finished its work. The bullhorn went. The negotiator's voice bounced off basalt and came back hollow and strange. A shot came back instead of words, supersonic and sudden, and everyone went flat behind cover. The helicopter circled high, unable to see into the basin. The afternoon light began to go. The temperature dropped fast. A siege. 3 hours in. A fanatic with supplies and walls, and the terrible advantage of someone who believes, absolutely, in the righteousness of what he is doing. The tactical team spoke their language of angles and breaches and entry points. Cliff stood with Bolt and understood that he was now only a witness. But the horse had not stopped trying. Still pulling toward the fissure. Still calling, in that low, searching, almost human register. As if he had located the thing he was looking for and was being prevented from reaching it by circumstances he didn't quite understand. As if the work was only half done. Cliff looked at the horse. He looked at the crack in the rock. He thought about a girl's face when she saw him, the frozen terror in beneath it, the banked coal, the ember that was still there after 4 years of effort to extinguish it. He went and found the sheriff. Brody. The horse. The face Brody turned on him had exactly no patience left. What about the horse? He found them. Not me. I rode that pasture 100 times. He's the one who stopped. He's the one who led me to the gap. Cliff kept his voice steady. What if he knows the girl? What if she's his person and he still knows it, and he's been smelling her in there every time the wind comes from the right direction, and tonight is the first time he's had a chance to do something about it? Cliff. He's a horse. He's a horse who stopped when no person stopped. Who found a gap I rode past for 30 years and never saw. Who has been trying to get back in there for 3 hours without stopping. Cliff met his eyes. You're out of options. Your sniper has no shot. A breach gets someone killed. You have nothing to lose. Brody looked at him for a long time. The helicopter beat its heavy circles. The temperature kept dropping. He'll shoot it. He won't. He's built a story about being their protector. Shooting a horse in front of them tears the story. It doesn't fit. Another silence. You're a crazy old man, Burrows. I know it. Do it. But you come back here or I'll arrest you for the rest of your natural life. Cliff went back to bolt. Untied the rein. The horse immediately pulled toward the rock face with the steady, purposeful pull of something that knows exactly where it is going. Cliff put his face against the horse's face. He could feel the heat coming off him, the rapid pulse, the trembling that had not stopped in 3 hours. I don't know who you're looking for, Cliff said, quietly, because this felt like a private conversation. But you go find her. Go on. He pulled the halter off. The horse stood for one fraction of a second, completely still, as if the absence of constraint had surprised him. Then he wheeled, a full tight pivot, hooves cracking on the volcanic gravel, and galloped straight at the crack in the cliff face and vanished into the dark. Inside, something had broken. Mark Rogan's calm, the specific terrible calm of a man who has organized his entire interior world around a conviction, had begun to fracture in the hours since Cliff Burrows appeared in the basin. He had paced. He had argued. He had said the things he always said, in the voice he always used. The world outside was gone, was broken, was poison. He had rescued them. He was their shield. He was their father. He was the only truth left. Maya, who was 15 and had been 11 when she arrived, believed him. Or believed him enough. For years of a closed world that insists on itself until it is all there is. She was in the corner now, her fingers in her ears, weeping. Sarah Jones, who was 16, did not believe him. Not entirely. She had never entirely believed him, which was why the first year had been the hardest, why she still had the places on her wrists where the restraints had been, why the ember had gone so small and so deep she had almost stopped feeling it. Almost. The old man's face. The lines in it. The pale eyes. The absolute, unmistakable quality of a person who belongs to the world outside, the real world, the world that still existed, that had been out there this whole time, that had not burned or broken or poisoned itself into the ruin Mark described with such calm and practiced certainty. She had not said anything when the shot rang out. She stood very still in the way she had learned, not the stillness of peace but the stillness of a person conserving themselves for the moment when stillness is no longer the right thing. Then from outside came a sound. Not a voice. Not a gunshot. Not the mechanical percussion of the helicopter. A horse. Whinnying. High and searching, with a particular register in it that she heard with her whole body before she heard it with her ears, the way you hear music you loved long ago, in the chest before the mind. She knew that sound. She had grown up with that sound. She had been 12 years old and raised a Palomino foal from birth, named him Sundown for the streak of gold in his mane that caught the evening light and held it. She had spent 2 years learning him and being learned by him. 2 years of the wordless conversation that happens between a young person and their horse when both of them are paying genuine attention. And then the farm was gone and the horse was sold, and she had ridden away one Tuesday afternoon and turned a corner in the world that only went one way. She shoved past Mark Rogan. She threw open the heavy door. In the cold twilight of the basin, a Palomino gelding stood at the gate of the goat pen. His coat was good now, filled out and healthy, the gold streak in his mane catching even the flat gray light of an October evening. He was calling, in the calling had in it the quality of an animal that is very close to what it is looking for and knows it. Mark raised the rifle. "No," Sarah said. And the word was different from any word she had sent in 4 years. Not the no of negotiation or the no of desperation. The no of someone who has just found solid ground under their feet for the first time in a very long time and is not, under any circumstances, going to move. She stepped down into the cold. The horse's head snapped around. The ears came forward. Every line of his body changed. The pacing stopped. The calling stopped. He stood completely still, the way a horse stands still when it has found what it was looking for and is making absolutely certain. "Sundown," she said. One word. For years of silence and loss and the daily grinding effort of keeping something alive inside herself when everything around her insisted there was nothing left to keep alive. One word, and the name in her mouth was a key. The horse walked to her. Not trotted. Not galloped. Walked, with the deliberateness of something that has waited a long time for this and is not going to rush it. He stopped with his muzzle pressed to her chest, his breath warm and quick against her, and he smelled her the way horses smell the things they know, with their whole face, with their whole attention. She wrapped her arms around his neck. She put her face into his mane. The smell of him was exactly what it had always been. Horse sweat and dust, and the particular warm animal sweetness that she had breathed 10,000 times in a different life, in a life that had been real. For years of careful, deliberate, systematic destruction of a self, for years of being told that everything she remembered was gone, that the people she loved were lost, dissolved. Not slowly, not gradually. In one breath. In the smell of her horse, in the warmth of his neck, in the absolute, unargued, inarguable reality of him standing here in this basin. She pulled back. She looked at Mark Rogan. What he saw on her face was not anger, exactly, though there was that. It was something more complete. The expression of someone who has just been handed back themselves. She opened her mouth and screamed. Not in fear. In fury. In the righteous fury of someone who has just understood the full scope of what was taken from them and has decided, in this exact moment, that it stops now. We're here. Sarah and Maya. He has us, we're here. Outside, the tactical team moved. The charge on the door. The percussion grenade. The sudden violent entrance of people who were, compared to 4 years in a hidden canyon, almost incomprehensibly loud and fast and real. Mark Rogan, who had managed everything for 4 years with perfect patience and complete control, who had led the search teams astray and accepted the plaques and looked the families in the eyes, had not thought about the horse. He was on the ground in seconds. He was still talking. Still insisting. Still, even as they cuffed him and walked him toward the passage, using the same calm and certain voice. He was their protector. They were his family. The world outside was poison. He had saved them. He had. They walked him out through the crack in the rock and into the cold October night, and the voice faded. Maya Smart came out wrapped in a blanket, dazed, her eyes not yet knowing what to do with the lights and the people and the enormous open sky. She would need time. More time than most people would know how to give her. Sarah Jones came out on her own. She came out with her hand in her horse's mane. She walked past the deputies and the lights and the chaos, straight to the old rancher standing at the edge of the light. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him, and she looked at the horse, and she looked back at him. She didn't say anything, but she didn't let go of the reins. Cliff Burrows was sitting in a hospital waiting room in Burns 3 hours later, nursing a cup of bad coffee that had gone cold, when John Jones sat down next to him. Sarah's father. A man whose face had been used to carry something very heavy for a very long time and hadn't yet received the news that it could put it down. Red eyes. Shaking hands. He was staring out the window at Cliff's stock trailer under the security light. Bolt was tied to the trailer. He had not calmed down. He was refusing hay. His eyes were fixed on the hospital's sliding glass doors, and every time they opened, he called. "That's a fine horse," John Jones said. "He's a good one," Cliff said. "He looks just like..." John stopped, cleared his throat. "My Sarah, before she had a horse. Palomino foal. She raised him herself. Named him Sundown because of this one streak of pure gold in the mane. Right there. You can see it even in this light." Cliff Burrows went very still. The cup of cheap coffee suddenly felt cold in his hands. "We lost the farm," John continued. The words came quiet and careful, the way words come when they've been carried for a long time and are only now being set down. "About a year after she was gone. The bank. The bills don't stop just because your heart does. We had to sell everything. Livestock. All of it. Went to the auction in Burns. Sundown too. I never knew what became of him. I thought he was just gone. Like her." Cliff looked at the horse. He looked at the streak of gold in the mane, shining under the artificial light. He looked at the horse he had bought for $75 at an auction in Burns 2 years ago, the quiet, sad-eyed horse nobody else wanted, standing alone in the back of the pen with his head down, waiting. The horse who had stopped, today, at the edge of a canyon mouth. Who had trembled and called and refused to leave. Who had led him to the crack in the rock. Who had gone in alone, in the dark, at a full gallop, because the work wasn't finished. The room tilted slightly. "John," Cliff said, and his voice was not quite steady. "I think that is Sundown." He had been out there for 2 years. Carrying Cliff across the pastures. Working the fences. Doing his job with the quiet, reliable thoroughness of a horse who keeps his own counsel. And every time they rode the east pasture, every time the wind came from the right direction through the juniper curtain and out of the hidden crack in the cliff face, he had caught something. A scent. A memory. The specific, irreducible, unlosable smell of the one person in the world he belonged to. He had waited. Horses wait differently than people do. They don't count the days. They don't mark the calendar. They simply continue, and they hold what they know, and they wait for the moment when they can act on it. That moment came on a Tuesday in October, with the cold coming and the light going thin and an old rancher on his back checking the fences. Mark Rogan received 2 consecutive life sentences. The plaques bearing his name came down. The town's grief at the betrayal settled into a quiet, determined anger that is more sustainable than grief, and more useful. Maya Smart's road was long and difficult and is not over yet, and people who know her say she is braver than she knows, which is sometimes the most accurate compliment there is. Cliff Burrows drove out to the Jones family 6 months later with ownership papers in his hand. John said he couldn't possibly. Cliff said he wasn't offering, he was returning. He was never mine to begin with. He was just waiting. The spring came. On the edge of the Jones property, where a new modest barn stood smelling of fresh pine and sweet hay, a hand-carved sign swung in the mild breeze. Sundown Ranch Equestrian Therapy Center. Inside, Sarah Jones grooming her horse in the afternoon light, Sundown's coat shining like something that had been through the dark and come back. Maya smart on the top rail of the fence, her feet not quite reaching the ground, watching. Cliff Burrows standing beside her with a soft lead rope, his voice down to the register he used with new foals. "Not tight," he said. "You don't pull. You just invite him. You let him know you're the boss, but you're a kind boss. Here." He held the rope out. Maya flinched, looked at the horse, looked at Cliff, looked at Sarah, who gave her the small, real, hard-won smile of someone who has been exactly where you are and knows the next thing is possible even when it doesn't feel like it. Slowly, a small trembling hand reached out, took the rope. Sundown turned his head, took one soft step forward. Cliff stood in the pale spring light of a high desert and felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in 15 years. He had come out to check a fence. He had bought a horse for $75. He had done what he always did. He had listened to his animal. And the animal had done what it always does, if you give it the time and the space and the relationship it needs. It had found its person. It had come home.